welcome to the third episode of Issues in History Today. In this episode, we'll be commemorating the 70th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, which is usually celebrated on May 8th, both in the United States and in Europe. I'm Dr. John Dreifert, Professor of History in Modern France, Modern Europe, and World War II. With me today are my colleagues, Dr. Jeff Hayton, who is our German historian and historian of the Holocaust, and Dr. Helen Hunley, who teaches Russian history, the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe. The topic today will be discussing the roles of the impact of World War II on the countries that we specialize in, Russia, modern France, and Germany. We're going to go and deal with several topics, several questions that we'll deal with. First, we're going to discuss what the war meant for these countries. Secondly, we're going to talk about the fighting that went on the last days of the war. And thirdly, we'll try and spend a few minutes dealing with the repercussions for the future of the war on the countries that we're dealing with. But first, I thought it would be a good idea to deal with some context for our topic today, by way of introduction. 1939 to 1945 is a short time in historical terms, a mere blip on the historical record. But more upheaval, more uprooting of people, more disasters occurred in terms of killing and destruction than any other comparable time in the history of mankind. And as a result of this, the effect of World War II is still having a role to play in our lives today. As we are well into the 21st century, we still see the impact of World War II on our lives and policies today. The war basically summed up a lot of the best and the worst of people. It placed some people's names in the record book that would never have ever made it before, made them immortal. Dwight Eisenhower, Marshal Zhukov, Charles de Gaulle, and others. And as a result of this, we know a lot more about them than we would otherwise. Secondly, we have also had an ability to commemorate other places we had never seen before or never thought of before. Who would have ever thought in 1939 that Midway or Bastogne or other places of that sort would be important in the history of the United States or Europe? So it's immortalized many places and many people, and therefore bears looking at in a more systematic way as we go forward today. The first question we're going to discuss today is the question of what the war meant for the countries that we're specialists in. First, I'm going to turn to my colleague in German history, Jeff Hayton. Jeff?
Thanks, John. For the Germans, since the immediate post-war World War I period, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, they tapped into a deep strain of racism and social Darwinism in Germany. And in so doing, they understood the world as a fundamentally competitive society in which the Germans and Germany needed to grow strong to regain their power after defeat. And in so doing, they needed to expand, because expansion showed virility and the state and of race, whereas the status quo suggested stagnation and perhaps even decay. And since the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Germany had been increasingly gearing itself towards a vast race war that would in many ways decide the fate of the modern world. And while there's a tremendous amount of dispute about what the Nazis planned, when they planned to do so, and so on, there can be no doubt that war played an instrumental role in Nazi thinking. Now this raises the question, why was war so important for the Nazis? And really this question revolves around the conception of society and the nation that the Nazis held. The Nazis sought to create what they called a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community, a national community, a racial community of Aryans that would protect those within, those who were racially acceptable as Aryans, and to exclude those harmful elements which, as they interpreted in 1918, had weakened the body that led to defeat. And so in the 1930s, the Nazis worked to purge their community of all of these toxins which might hinder this Nazi bid for expansion. Above all, this of course meant the Jews, but so too communists and socialists, Democrats, all those whom the Nazis labeled the November criminals, who had stabbed Germany in the back in 1918. Now, the war was pursued to secure what Hitler called Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Crucial to the racial community was the need to secure adequate space to grow. And since the 1920s, the Germans had spoken about the strain that was taking place on the racial community. And they looked to the East to take land from whom they considered racial inferiors, such as the Slavic races of Eastern Europe. Thus, for war, the Nazis, this war was always a question of life and death. They would either be victorious and expand, or they would be destroyed in the effort.
Thank you, Jeff. The war meant for France a little bit different. I want to look at the events surrounding VE Day and the subsequent developments in France, taking a little different perspective. On VE Day, May 8th of 1945, the cheering throngs crowded the Champs-Élysées all the way from the Étoile and the Arc de Triomphe all the way down to the Place de la Concorde. Allied planes periodically buzzed the crowds down below before elevating to get around the Arc de Triomphe, flying nearly at treetop level. But the next day, or a few days later, reality set in. The exhilaration quickly dissipated when the reality of the fact that France really had only had a marginal role in winning the war over the Germans. Despite General de Gaulle's attempts to develop a myth that France had liberated the French army had liberated France, there was no denying the fact that it had been accomplished really by American and British forces. Even the French forces that participated relied totally on American equipment, even uniforms. So clearly they had not much of a role in the liberating of France. The damage to France, of course, was much less in World War I than it was in World War II, partly because in World War I, the damage was confined mainly to the northeastern and northern parts of the country. In World War II, the situation was a little different because early in the war, the campaign of 1940 went so fast, there was only so much damage that could be leveled. But in the aftermath of the French defeat and the subsequent Allied bombings of France as well as Germany, France suffered a great deal in terms of the destruction of their infrastructure, railroads, harbors, roads, bridges, and so forth. So the damage was subsequently a lot more. With the Allied invasion of 1944, the fight went across France as the Allies pushed the Germans back to the German frontier. And so there was a great deal of destruction there as well. So in terms of damage, there was a lot more in World War II overall than there was in World War I. Another factor that I think is important to consider when dealing with the French at the time of the end of the war is a division of the country between us and them. Us, the ones who had resisted, them, the ones who had collaborated or who had gone along with the Nazi regime. And I'm reminded of this at a time when, years ago, a friend of mine claimed she had resisted the Nazis. She had resisted by refusing to date a Nazi soldier. What constitutes resistance and what constitutes a collaboration? Does delivering the mail mean collaboration? Does not dating a German soldier mean resistance? These are moral choices that French had to make throughout the war and divided the country well after the war. Helen, would you go ahead now and tell us about what the war meant for the Soviet Union?
Well, John and Jeff, there's a bit of both of your stories in the Soviet situation. As far as, talking about needing Lebensraum, the Lebensraum you wanted was the Soviet Union. And therefore there were Nazi troops from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south, all the way to Moscow, from Moscow to the western border, which essentially is European Soviet Union. Which leads us to the main meaning of the war for the Soviet people, and that was incredible devastation and incredible loss. And again, part of the German need to destroy the culture of the peoples they were invading. This is another big part of what the Nazis chose to do in the Soviet Union. And the end result was literally thousands of villages and towns and medium-sized cities that were flattened as a result of the war. I think most people know about the 900-day siege of Leningrad, and as this photo shows, you see symbolic military equipment in front of St. Isaac's Cathedral. Which again is part of that loss of the culture that was planned by the Nazis during the war. So there was the attempt to obliterate the culture. Tolstoy's home was seriously damaged and burned. And then you get into the issue of people themselves. People may not realize that up to 30 million Soviet citizens, civilians, were killed. And this is taking into account that a considerable percentage of the population was moved, it was called east of the Urals. And despite the fact that the Soviet government moved so many people, still 30 million civilians died. More than 1 million civilians died, not just of being bombed, but starvation in Leningrad. The terrible loss, about 13 million Soviet soldiers were killed. And the end result is that about 1 in 4 soldiers killed in World War II were wearing a Soviet uniform. And the final point here is the fury that comes from the knowledge of this. These soldiers who then pushed through towards Berlin all saw this. They knew this is what had happened to their society. They knew that this is what happened to this people. So essentially what the war meant was terrible devastation, terrible loss. And again, the consequences, not just immediately after the war, but for decades later, was profound and very visual for the Soviet people.
For the Germans, the last days of war, likewise, were characterized by an incredible amount of violence and destruction, more so than at any point in German history. The Germans fought to the bitter, bitter end. It's always important to remember that the last year of war saw the Germans suffer almost 50% of their casualties in the entire war. And there are a number of reasons for this. The Nazi regime had, of course, always rested upon a tremendous amount of coercion and violence, and such emphasis really reached its peak, beginning with the final Soviet offensive in January of 1945. For the first time, war was being fought on German soil. Soldiers were ordered to hold out at all costs. There was no retreats. Cities that had been surrounded by especially the Red Army were turned into fortresses. The Nazis even instituted a kind of final desperate levée en masse, what was called the Volkssturm, a militia composed of young boys and elderly gentlemen who were to fight to the last bullet. While in the West, the military became less inclined to fight the Western Allies, hoping against hope to the very end that the Western Allies might join them in a crusade against Bolshevism. In the East, there was no respite. The Wehrmacht fought until May of 1945 to the very last man. And this, of course, raises the question, why did the Germans fight to the bitter end? On the one hand, a decade of propaganda about Soviet brutality had convinced the German population that the Russians would inflict tremendous savagery upon them once they would arrive, as did, of course, the legacy of racial ideology. But the Nazis likewise were obsessed with 1918 and feared that Germany would surrender in a humiliating fashion. What the Nazi leadership wanted to do was to produce a heroic myth for future Aryan warriors. And going down in flames was part and parcel of this vision of utter destruction. And so to this end, the Nazis turned their terror apparatus upon their own population, instituting special courts to execute deserters and those accused of defeatism. Inmates in the concentration camps were executed, and the death camps in the east, such as Auschwitz, were evacuated, with almost 250,000 more people dying during the so-called death marches. Of course, what this fanaticism did was fundamentally rupture the agreement between the Nazis and the German population. In the last year, Germans, for the most part, severed their relationship with Nazism. And while Hitler wanted to create a glorious example for future generations, most Germans were simply wanted to survive, and they increasingly saw the Nazis as hindering their survival.
You're right on one point here, and that is the Soviets did rain down terrible terror on the German people when they did arrive. Back again to the issue of what the war meant in terms of loss and destruction was incredible fury, and that incredible fury was unleashed in the winter and the spring of 1945. The Soviets began their movement westward January 19th, and between January 19th and April 20th of 1945, the Soviet army moved across first to Warsaw in Poland, then south to southern Poland to Silesia, further south to Budapest, before turning towards Berlin. This might seem have been a bit of a road trip, but this is another one of these foreshadowing moments for the Soviets thinking about the future, and Stalin realized that he needed a footprint of where the Soviet troops had been for the post-war world. That did not mean they had forgotten their main goal, and that was the destruction of Nazi Germany, and specifically the taking of Berlin. So when they arrived in the outskirts of Berlin, April 20th, because of what you were talking about, this determination not to surrender, to go to the last person, to even include young teenage boys in the fighting, the Germans did not stand down. So between April 20th and May 2nd, the Soviets pounded Berlin. The picture here with the flag shown over the Reichstag of the Soviet success. So as the Germans are devastated by this experience, the Soviets were very happy. Another aspect of this is that after the Soviets won on May 2nd, the population was then treated very, very harshly by the occupying Soviet forces. Zhukov, the leader, lost control of his troops, who pillaged and raped up to half of the German women in Berlin. So when it was finally controlled, Zhukov had to kill some of his own troops in order to calm them down, which is an indicator of the viciousness of the final days.
Helen, that story of destruction really hammers home the experience of Germans in the immediate post-war period that was characterized above all by piles of rubble and a flood of people. At war's end, Germany was utterly destroyed thanks to the Allied bombing campaign. The German home front had experienced war in a way that it hadn't in the First World War. Germany's cities, especially in the West, were reduced to utter ruin, where they resembled, in many ways, the moon. Urban centers were now simply piles of where buildings had once been. Cities like Cologne and Berlin were completely obliterated. It's estimated that almost 500,000 German civilians died from the bombing, which also rendered about a quarter of Germany's population homeless. And homelessness also points to the second major characteristic of Germans in the immediate aftermath, with millions of people streaming into the Reich, fleeing the Red Army and what awaited them at Soviet hands. As part of the Nazi racial empire, 1 million ethnic German pioneers had been settled in Eastern Europe, but as the Soviets turned the tide of war, a vast horde of Germans and collaborators fled ahead of them. Similarly, after the end of the war, the new states of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, made the decision to expel their German citizens. And in the end, around 10 million ethnic Germans were forced to relocate, the majority to Western Germany. And this history of flight, expulsion, and retreat, it is only now being written by scholars, but this was an incredibly traumatic experience for the millions of Germans who fled Eastern Europe in the last days of the Reich. So for Germans, war's end meant, regardless of which Allied zone of occupation you ended up in, rebuilding was the dominant motif of your everyday life. And for Germans, once again defeated, occupied, under the threat of prosecution for wartime and criminal activities, the need to come to terms both individually and as a nation with a severe loss of agency played an important role. Now Germany was on the front lines of the Cold War, but in a conflict in which they weren't dictating the movement of history. And the legacy of destruction and violence experienced by Germans in the last year of war perhaps most consequentially created a nation of victims. Whether from the bombings, the military casualties, flight, these narratives of suffering work to push away and bury those narratives of guilt at what the Nazi regime had done and what everyday Germans had been a part of.
Well, Jeff, it's interesting that you would talk about revenge and Helen the same thing and the mass destruction that went on in Germany and Eastern Europe at the end of the war. And I think the French, although they didn't have near the destruction that Germany had to undergo, there was still a great revenge factor that went on. I mentioned a few minutes ago about the large number of people who were faced with daily decisions of whether to collaborate or just get on with their lives, which might be assumed to be collaboration, led to a lot of revenge and settling of old scores in the immediate post-war period. Some 50,000 people disappeared in the course of the immediate post-liberation era. Some ran away, some got killed, some never got found. Some 20,000 were arrested, 800 were executed for crimes committed during the Vichy period. So there was a great deal of revenge that went on in the immediate post-war period, post-liberation period in France. For the long term, the real significant aspect of the war for France was the fear among the French nationalists that France would lose its great power status. It had been so quickly and catastrophically defeated in 1940. It had collaborated with the Germans through the Vichy regime. There was a fear among de Gaulle and other nationalists that France would cease to be taken seriously as a great power. And so they were, in the course of the post-war period, to pursue policies that were very prickly as far as the West was concerned, with regard to the United Nations, with regard to the treatment of Germany, with regard to NATO, and in terms of not only France, but the United States ultimately, with regard to their treatment of their colonial empire. The belief was more and more apparent in France that the empire would help to restore them to greatness. And this is ironic because the French had basically ignored their empire for most of its existence. But now they saw it as a road back, just at a time when the empire, as a result of the war, was beginning to feel that France really didn't deserve to control it any longer. And so you have this indigenous nationalism versus the metropolitan nationalism of France heading on a collision course, leading ultimately to the war in Indochina, the failure of France in Indochina, and ultimately involving the United States in the war in Vietnam, had direct repercussions for the United States. Ultimately, of course, the failure in Indochina meant that the French were even more desperate to succeed in Algeria. The war in Algeria became a very bloody affair that ultimately not only resulted in the French getting kicked out, but also in a revolution in France, bringing de Gaulle to power in 1958.
Well, John and Jeff, for the Soviets and the Russians today, World War II, as you all know it, was a good war. There's a different attitude towards it, and is part of the a celebration time in May that runs from May 1st to May 9th. And may stretch over a 2-week period. It's symbolic of even the title of what the Russians to this day call the war, and that is not World War II, but the Second Great Fatherland War. The First Great Fatherland War being the Napoleonic invasion of Russia in 1812. So the War of 1812 is the First Great Fatherland War, and World War II is the Second Great Fatherland War for them. And so it comes apart, being that good war. It's about the nation, about a shared experience for most of the peoples of the Soviet Union. And so that is symbolically to this day, even though the Soviet Union no longer exists and there are new states, there is that shared experience of World War II and the role of defeating the Nazis. In most recent times, in 2015, here at the time of the 70th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, which, as I mentioned, is celebrated in Russia on May 9th because they signed their documents the day afterwards, even separating themselves a little bit apart from France and Great Britain and the United States a day later. So their celebration would be the day after the main celebration, and the plan of a major celebration this year is getting caught up in current politics. On the one hand, there's a reminder of the greatness of the war going on, suggestion this winter that perhaps Volgograd will be renamed Stalingrad to remind everyone of the great success of the war. On the other hand, this celebration of Victory in Europe Day is running into some political problems because of current politics and Russian involvement in Crimea and Ukraine in 2014 and 15, which is leading to a situation where some countries are refusing to go to the celebration. These photographs of first of the celebration of the original end of World War II, the original victory parade in Moscow in Red Square, shows Marshal Zhukov, the hero of the Battle of Berlin, riding his horse, celebrating the end of the war in June of 1945. Because of Soviet politics, a statue could not be put up to him until the 1990s, and what you see here is what is the statue you see as you enter Red Square today, Zhukov on his horse in bronze.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope that you've enjoyed our discussion of VE Day and its meaning for some countries of Europe. If you'd like to review this episode, it will run on WSU-TV on your local channels in Kansas. And the episode will be available on WSU-TV on YouTube soon. Future episodes will include topics on significant 100th anniversary years of World War I. This episode was made possible by the financial support of the Department of History of Wichita State University.